I'm Dana Perino, and this is Perino on Politics. Today marks 1 year since Hamas terrorists unleashed a devastating attack on Israel. As the conflict in the Middle East continues to escalate, it remains a key issue that could shape the outcome of the 2024 presidential election. Joining me today is my friend, CEO of the Senate Leadership Fund, who served as Deputy Secretary of Labor under President George W. Bush. His name is Stephen Law. He's done a lot of other things, too, which we can get into. He's one of the most kind and hilarious people I've ever met. Let me welcome all of you to Perino on Politics, where I call my smart friends up and I say, what's on your mind about the state of American politics? So today we start with Stephen, but instead of starting with politics, let's just take a moment to reflect on this incredible year that it's been for Israel, for the victims of Hamas, for what has happened in the politics of Israel and how that's even been affected over here, and the hostages that remain, including 4 Americans. So, Stephen, before we jump into politics, which I know you and I love to talk about, I thought I would get your reflections on October 7th and either personal or even how you think it might affect the election here.
Yeah, just a couple things occur to me on that when I think about the year that Israel's been through and the entire region has been through. And 2 things stand out to me. First of all, Iran got the regional war that it intended when it launched Hamas fighters into Israel to rape and kill and torture and take hundreds of hostages. They wanted this. Many people forget that happened on October 7th. The very next day, Hezbollah entered the conflict by raining rockets and missiles on Israel as an intention of expanding the war. The Houthis, who have the organizational ability to barely operate a coffee shop, joined the conflict on October 19th with rockets fired at Israel, and then they ended up doing everything they could to disrupt everything that was going on in the Gulf. Now, none of these terrorist proxy groups does anything without checking with Iran first. I mean, they don't order lunch without checking with Iran because they can't afford lunch. So this was a planned effort. The reason we have a regional conflict is because Iran wanted the regional conflict. But the second thing is, just briefly on this, is we also have 2 different models of warfare that we're seeing. First is the Israeli model, which is the model that has existed for millennia, which is the aim of warfare is to defeat your enemy and, most importantly, to destroy their ability to attack you again. Now, in contrast to that is a Biden-Harris-Obama model of warfare, which is it's a problem to be managed. We sweep things under the rug. We try to get everybody to talk to each other so that we can get past the next election. But that doesn't win wars. So what Israel is doing is responding to a regional war that Iran designed, and they're winning it. And meanwhile, here in this country, you have Biden and Harris who are doing everything they can to prevent them from executing the aim of warfare that you need to have to succeed.
And I think I've mentioned this on this podcast before, so forgive me, listeners, but it sticks with me, so I want to bring it up again. I talked to a voter in Pennsylvania on America's Newsroom. He's Jewish, and he's probably 65 years old. Told me that he has always his whole life voted for Democrats for many, many reasons, which we don't have to get into here. But he said he is a single issue voter this year, and his issue is Israel and the existence of it, continued existence of it. And he said that he couldn't understand, if you are a Zionist, why you would ever think of voting for Harris. And so for the first time in his life, he is going to vote for Trump. He said, I don't like Trump. He goes, but I trust him more on Israel than I do Harris. And I wonder if you hear that from other people, and maybe even a reflection back to 2004, re-elect for George W. Bush. He actually did better with Jewish Americans than he had in 2000. And I imagine partly that's because of the war on terror. And could that make a difference this year, especially in a state like Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I think so, because the other ingredient, in addition to this ambivalence that you see with Biden-Harris as to the fundamental importance of protecting the continued viability of Israel, is what's happening here in this country. I was at a wedding over the weekend at St. John's Church, which you recall is off of Lafayette Park across from the White House. And in the middle of the wedding, there was an elaborately staged, very loud, angry protest outside. It was not inside the church, but it was outside, but you could hear it. And as we stepped out after the wedding, they were shouting, there is only one solution, global intifada revolution. And you have this new strain, and a very substantial and organized one, that is deliberately and openly anti-Semitic, that embraces terrorism globally as a means of achieving some sort of new world order. And there's been this kind of pussyfooting around this in the Democratic Party, and Democrats in general not openly condemning that kind of behavior. And so for Jews living in this country now feeling unsafe in a serious way, in a way they haven't for decades in this country, is something that I think is causing a lot of American Jews to say, this is an election that will define my children's and my grandchildren's future for generations to come. So
I keep talking about Pennsylvania, and it may be making a difference there in that battleground state, but are there other states that are presidential battlegrounds where it could also make a difference?
Well, I think more generally, if you have people who are concerned about the chaos that's in the world, that's happened in some measure because of the weakness of this administration on the world stage, I think you could see voters responding to that. And, there's a significant number of Jewish voters in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, in Nevada as well. And I think when people look at the basic approach of the Democratic Party to this, it's to try to avoid the issue, have everybody somehow get along. And when it comes to domestic groups that are preaching anti-Semitism and global intifada revolution, they just don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think could reverberate in some of these elections. These aren't gigantic numbers of voters, but each of these elections, both at the presidential level and at the Senate level, will be decided by small numbers of votes.
So we are going to talk about the Senate races, which you know very well, probably better than anybody we could ever have on this podcast. But before we do that, and maybe I'll even save that for the second segment, I want to ask you about your sense of the presidential horse race. We are really in the home stretch. It's a month to go, and it looks tied-ish. Yesterday, I was driving along, in my little Moke car with the dog, and I took a right on Osborne Avenue, and I just had this feeling that on November 6th, I could see myself explaining why Harris lost or why Trump lost. And I felt like I could do either of those things by explaining how that happened. I don't know if I could do the same of how they won necessarily. Trump maybe more than I could explain that more than Harris is, although I guess part of that is just saying that I must just think it's a tie as well. How do you see it?
I mean, this is as close to a pure toss-up race as I've seen in a long time. I obviously consume a lot of polling and information from pollsters, and all of them note the fact that the presidential race, at both the national numbers, which don't matter that much, but much more consequentially, the numbers in these critical battleground states that will matter in the Electoral College, it's been set virtually dead ties, especially at these battleground states, for weeks with relatively little movement. And I think part of it is both candidates are very, very focused on their base at this point. You see everything that Kamala Harris is doing, focusing especially on abortion, on this notion of Trump being a threat to democracy. That is 100% focused at their base. And then when you see Trump, particularly in his rallies, things that he says, things that he talks about, it is very much of a base motivation election. And the question is whether anybody grabs that very narrow but not inconsequential band of voters who are still in the middle trying to make hay out of which candidate they might end up supporting. Yeah, I think both candidates are going to have a lot of enthusiasm behind their respective tickets. And the question is, for those few who are still figuring out what to do, will they take that little icing on the cake that will help them win in these critical states like Michigan and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, even still Arizona? I think feel better about Georgia and North Carolina. But these are going to be very, very close races all the way to the end, I think.
Harris's team is pointing to recent relatively better economic news to say, stick with her. I once read that people have long memories when it comes to inflation and economic pain, and that a good jobs report on a Friday the month before an election is not necessarily going to sway them. We see in the polls that the economy is the number one issue for people. Is that your experience as well this year?
I think that's true, but it often means different things at different times and also to different people. Right now, there is relatively less general economic anxiety, relatively less concern about people losing their jobs. But they are very concerned about inflation and the cost of living, and those continue to be persistent problems, especially the further down the income level you go. I mean, your average person who works as a political consultant or is, in media doesn't feel those things as acutely as if you're, basically getting by on $40,000 a year and trying to feed a family of four. And one of the things that's a problem, I think, for Harris is that middle income and lower middle income voters who have historically always thought of themselves as Democrats and voted as Democrats are taking a look at Trump as the person who's talking about that issue and is proposing in a very serious way to deal with it. And they're not fooled by gimmicks like greedflation and shrinkflation. They know what inflation is, and that's affecting them. There was a great article this last week in the Philadelphia Inquirer about how blue-collar people in Philadelphia who have always voted Democrat are starting to look at Trump more favorably because of that issue alone.
Then let me ask you this. Barack Obama is going to come out of the woodwork, and he did a great job, but I would say Michelle Obama did better for Kamala Harris at their convention, but he's been quiet ever since. I'm like, okay, is anybody going to campaign for her? He's jumping in. On Thursday, he'll be there in Pittsburgh, and I assume he's probably going to try to close hard. Elon Musk joined President Trump at his Butler rally over the weekend. That was an incredible turnout. And what, honestly, my favorite line of this entire election season will come down to President Trump welcoming the crowd and then saying, as I was saying, to open his speech, which I thought was brilliant and funny and took the sting out of things and allowed people to cheer and laugh. And what a moment. So he really captured it. Elon Musk is on the stage. And I was reading Selena Zito from Washington Examiner. Fans of this podcast know her well. She's on often. And she said that blue-collar people can relate to Elon Musk because they respect how he's an industrialist. Mm-hmm. And he is somebody who's like a big thinker that's creating jobs. And they might not care so much about the intricacies of all the other things going on in the election in terms of the economy, but that they see a better future for themselves and their children if they're going in a direction of innovation like with Elon Musk. And I just wonder what you think about those two candidates, Kamala Harris and Trump, utilizing these big names that are kind of cultural icons and becoming political icons on the Elon Musk front going into this last little bit.
Yeah, I think the contrast can't help but be a boon to Trump. You and I have talked a number of times that I think President George W. Bush said this, that elections are often about the future, usually about the future. It's not what happened in the past. My one concern at different points about former President Trump was there was always a reflection backwards. Here's how things were. And someone like Elon Musk helps frame it toward the future. Democrats in general really hate business people unless they're writing them very large checks. They think there's something unseemly about business. They hate the idea of profit. They're suspicious about economic growth that's not created by the government. And you're exactly right. Most people like business innovators. There may be certain kinds of businesses they find less attractive, but somebody like him who's getting us into space, who's creating this incredible satellite network that can help people in areas that can't otherwise get cell service. I mean, this guy is solving problems, and he's a very smart thinker. People like that kind of a person. And President Obama has got solidly decent approval ratings, but he is a politician of the past, and there's nothing more than that. He's one who ended up being popular. Most former presidents end up being more popular, but I don't think he communicates anything that Kamala doesn't already have. And for people who remember the Obama years as not particularly great, it may subtract from her a little bit.
What do you think of Kamala Harris's media strategy, which is not to do a lot of traditional media? And a part of me is like, okay, fine. But then when she does, and we haven't seen 60 Minutes, we'll see that tonight, it lacks in specificity. It's so vague. As I sit there and I think, how have you been in the White House for 3.5 years and you still aren't able to talk about these things in a commanding manner?
Yeah, well, it's clearly why they keep her out of these unrehearsed settings, because she is just strangely inarticulate, strangely lacking in confidence when answering any questions that aren't on her cue card list. And it's kind of funny, this morning, they announced that Harris and Waltz were going to do a media blitz, and you could even see the air quotes in the mainstream press's coverage of this. It's like saying, I'm going to go fight for my country, and meanwhile, that means you're going to go in the basement and play Call of Duty for 3 hours. I mean, it's not real. And on the occasion that it is real, she does do terribly, and she comes across, probably most fatally, as just disingenuous, like she's hiding the ball, and she probably doesn't know what to say, so she's just turning out word salad. And so I think. I don't know if it works forever. They may be trying to get away with another basement strategy, which is what they did 4 years ago with Joe Biden. But she's especially bad at it. And the one thing about Biden is, he does lie. He does all the things that a lot of politicians do, but he comes across somehow as he himself, as a genuine person. And I think that's a real problem with Harris, is the more she talks, you just think, this person is not a real person. There's something else that she's trying to project.
That she's holding back. Yeah, I've described it as she's running not to lose rather than running to win. And there's a difference there. And that's one of the reasons I could see on November 6th explaining to people why Trump won. But as I say that, I think, but she could win. So, yes, we are tied, and we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Perino on Politics. And welcome back to Perino on Politics. So, Stephen, you help Republicans who are trying to win Senate races, amongst other things that you do, but that's a real focus of yours right now. And tell us a little bit about the numbers that you're looking to hit, like what your goals are, and how that's going. And also, I wondered if you could just wrap into this. I could be wrong on this. I read somewhere that if Republicans are able to win the majority this year, that they could be in really good shape for the next several cycles or few cycles because of the way the map works. When I said that to Senator Thune on America's Newsroom the other day, I could tell he was politely pushing back on that, like I didn't know what I was talking about. So let me turn it over to you, and on my Safe Space podcast, you can tell me, am I right or wrong on what I read?
Yeah, absolutely. It depends entirely on what the result is in November. This election cycle is actually our best opportunity to get the majority back. And so much of what affects election outcomes, obviously, is the political complexion of the individual states that are in play. And we have an unusual opportunity this time because there are 3 Democrat-held Senate seats that are in states that are overwhelmingly Republican and will vote for Donald Trump for president, even if he doesn't do well anywhere else. And those 3 states are West Virginia, Montana, and Ohio. And so we start with on the front foot in each of those. In each of those 3 states, however, the reason that a Democrat has been occupying that seat for multiple terms in each case is these guys are survivors, they're wily, they're smart, they're actually excellent politicians. And they have a name brand in their states. Fortunately, one of them decided to retire. That was Joe Manchin in West Virginia, and he was chased out by the equally colorful and beloved governor of that state, Jim Justice. So West Virginia is all but tucked away. We feel reasonably good about winning Montana at this point. Tim Sheehy has a lead there. He's got a great resume. Democrats have unloaded toxic waste on him for a solid year. In fact, longer than a year. They started in September of 2023. They've hit him with everything they can. He's right side up, and he's leading on the ballot. That feels reasonably good to us. Ohio, similarly, Donald Trump should win that state by 8 percentage points. Democrat Sherrod Brown has been around for a long time. He's a smart guy, but we believe we are starting to really cut into his image, cutting into his ballot position, and we think that Bernie Moreno ought to be in a position to win that seat. I don't know that we're leading there yet, but we are extremely close, and the progress we've made has been great. So those three get us at least to 51, maybe beyond that. And the reason why that's so crucially important is it's a little bit the opposite, which is if you look at the election cycles ahead in 2026, 2028, we're going to be mostly on defense.
So I was wrong.
You might have been wrong.
Hey, I'm not ashamed to admit it.
So the hope is, look, the most important thing is we get to 51, because if we lose the White House and we lose the House with it, if we don't have 51 seats, remember, as you know, Dana, if you have the White House, you have the vice president to break ties in the Senate. The vice president is also the president of the Senate. Kamala Harris has already cast more tie-breaking votes as vice president than any other sitting vice president in history, even John Calhoun, ever. And if Democrats get a functioning majority in the Senate with the White House and the House, all they need is 50. They can get rid of the filibuster. They would then pack the Senate with a couple of more Democrat majority states, like for District of Columbia. They would then pack the Supreme Court. That's very, very important to them. There's an article just today in the Wall Street Journal about noted political philosopher John Legend, the singer, at a Democratic fundraiser, beating up on these Democrats who were there, saying you absolutely have to get rid of the filibuster. And he said accurately, you basically cannot achieve the progressive revolution if you have the filibuster. You have to get rid of it. And what Democrats have done is they've created this pretext that they're only going to get rid of it for abortion. Well, that's a lie. It's always a lie. And they'll use it to push through everything else they want to do to structurally change the government, such as expanding the Senate and the Supreme Court, and then to do the long march toward socialism that they hope to achieve. So you got to get to 51, which is what's really driven our focus principally on Montana and Ohio. And then we do see some other opportunities in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But the reason for that is, as we said earlier, you look at these other cycles, Republicans are going to be a lot more on defense, more seats to defend relatively few pickup opportunities. In 2026, we'll be defending Maine, whether Senator Susan Collins runs or not. Tom Tillis always has a tough re-election fight. The only really viable pickup opportunity that we see at the moment, at least, in 2026 is Georgia, when Senator Ossoff is going to be running for re-election. So it is tougher. We need, hopefully, to get a little bit, at least, beyond 51 so we have a buffer.
So you're looking at the possibilities of picking up Montana.
Yes.
And also, Maryland is kind of interesting. So for people who think, wow, there could be a Republican senator from Maryland, how could that be? Tell us a little bit about that race and how the Republican Senate folks like yourself convinced former Governor Larry Hogan to throw his hat in the ring.
Well, I think Governor Hogan's decision in that case was 100% from within. In fact, there's an interesting story about how he got a letter from a constituent who also happened to work for the National Republican Senatorial Committee, but he wrote just as a constituent and someone who knew him, just telling him that this was the moment and he was the person who could, win this open seat race, and that he was really beloved by the citizens of Maryland. And all that's true. Larry Hogan has the best approval numbers of any politician I've seen in any state ever. That's not an exaggeration. That is a statement of fact. Democrats love him. Black voters love him. Even liberal Democrats are okay with him. And that it's more than just them having a vague positive feeling about his record as governor. There's a sense of trust. There's a connection there. The challenge is that in a state that Democratic, where Donald Trump is going to lose by 30 percentage points or more, that's an awful lot of ticket splitters to hold on when the natural inclination of every voter is to go to the party base, to put your jerseys on and just vote straight ticket. I think in addition to Hogan's personal and political strength, I do think his opponent, Angela Alsobrooks, is fairly weak. She's already had some personal tax issues that have come out that are being litigated. I don't think we're seeing the end of that. There's a story out today about how, as Prince George's County executive, she took contributions from companies that have contracts with PG County, one of which is a garbage collector that has screwed up garbage collection in the state, in her county, and that's a big problem in the county. PG County is viewed as having a lot of crime problems, a lot of management problems, and a history of corruption problems, and she's kind of part of all that. And so that kind of contrast between somebody you know and trust who has the wrong party label versus somebody who has the right party label but is really hard to square with thinking that's going to be your best person in the Senate gives him an opportunity.
And for anybody thinking that Texas and Florida, where there are Senate races, that those are going to be taken by Democrats, I mean, can we just set that aside as like that's obviously not happening, but the Democrats want you to keep donating, so that's why you keep seeing that in your inbox?
It certainly seems that way, especially with Colin Allred. Most of his ads now are just about give me money, and that's when you start to wonder whether. And
Colin Allred, just for everybody, he's a former football player, retired football player, a young father. He's in Congress, and he's running against Ted Cruz in Texas.
Right, and he does represent a part of the state where you've got a lot of suburban voters that, kind of tend to swing one way or the other, Republican versus Democrat. I think that Senator Cruz and Senator Rick Scott are two of the MVPs of the Senate cycle because they knew they were going to have contested races. Democrats knew they were going to try to raise a lot of money against them, and they took their races seriously. Senator Cruz, in particular, has been both a very disciplined senator and he's a very disciplined candidate. And I think he's running a very good race, solid positive ads about his record, including with Democrats who are endorsing him because of his record on the border and fighting fentanyl, and a fairly clear enunciation of why Texas voters should vote against Colin Allred. Allred looks the part, sounds the part, plays the part of being a moderate Democrat. But the truth of the matter is he's been a down-the-line supporter of the Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries agenda on virtually every issue, including on some of these real hot-button cultural issues, such as having drag queens and sex change surgeries in the military. I mean, things like that are very hard to square with somebody like that who's going to be competitive across the board in a state like Texas.
Yeah. All right. So that's fool's gold, everybody. My last question for you in this segment, I wondered if I could just get your reflections on what it's like to live through a political realignment. I was asked a question over the weekend in Utah by a reporter about what happened to American politics. And I said, I think we don't know the answer to that yet because we are living through the middle of a political realignment. And I explained that I was too young to really know what was happening when the Reagan Revolution happened, even though my family was supportive of Reagan and I thought he was going to save me from the Ayatollah, and my politics have always been on the conservative side. And so there were Reagan Democrats, and those Reagan Democrats became Republican voters. And when I first started in politics, all the college-educated people were for Republicans, and now that's clearly not the case. And the working class was always for Democrats. That's changing rapidly. And I just don't think we know the end of the story yet. I think we're just in the middle of it, but I wondered what you thought.
I think that's exactly right, and it's hard for people who've been in politics for a long time, like me, to make sense of it, or at least have that context. Dana, you know, my daughter Charlotte has always been extremely precocious about politics and understands it. And when Donald Trump went down the escalator in Trump Tower, she said, "Well, what do you think?" And I thought, I don't know. I don't know that he's going to end up going very far. And she said, no, you listen to what he's saying, listen to what he's talking about, and even how he's talking about it. And I think on the Republican side, certainly, you'd really have to give the former president a lot of credit for certainly harvesting changes that were going on in the party, probably before him. There's a great book that you and I both know called American Carnage that lays out how
it's a great book.
In some ways was a culmination of things that were happening both nationally and in the Republican Party prior to this, but he has a style and an appeal, kind of a casual, non-political outsider style that really appeals to more working class voters who disdain experts, people who just seem to, be speaking from talking points, and they like this kind of unrehearsed, deliberate offense-giving style of politics that Trump can do. And I think he is realigning the party, as you note. Working class voters, including increasingly voters of color, are starting to take a look at this party, and particularly looking at him and saying that's a place I can relate to because they understand, and Donald Trump speaks to my problems. And as you note, the cost of that has been a lot of suburban voters, more affluent, more educated, who don't like President Trump's style, don't like the way he operates, don't like some of the issues he talks about. And we're seeing that happen. And they're currently going to the Democratic Party. They probably will stay there for a while, but this could be generations long in processing all of this that's happened. And
it's interesting because of all the things that we read about younger people like Generation Z being more conservative than the millennials. So we shall see. It's fascinating to live through it, and we will be right back with more Perino on Politics. And welcome back to Perino on Politics. This is a bit of a shorter segment, but this is where I ask people like you who are so smart, what might I be missing in the last month of this election, and what you're paying attention to that myself and the listeners should be looking to if we want to sound really smart at the Oktoberfest parties we're going to.
Well, I'll try to recommend some beers. I don't know. But one of the things that we are increasingly focused on, and you're going to see advertising on this, is the Inflation Reduction Act. That sounds so boring, but there are things underneath it that are really significant that a lot of people have forgotten, even though it passed about a year ago. First of all, obviously the title was an intended fraud. It was intended to convince people that act had anything to do with inflation, and everybody knew that it wouldn't. But second, buried in that is a lot of the Green New Deal that has provisions that are fairly distasteful. Right now, we're on the air in Michigan going after Alyssa Slotkin, who voted for all that. And embedded in all of that is a war on gasoline-powered vehicles and, in fact, anything that is not fundamentally just a green energy source. And her votes on that would put the auto manufacturing industry of Michigan out of existence and move those jobs to places like Mexico and China. In addition, in that act, there are huge subsidies that went to companies that were owned by China. The Chinese have benefited more from the Inflation Reduction Act than any American worker to date. And some of the investments, whether to companies that had a Chinese connection or not, some of those companies are already going belly up, and they will continue to as these investments prove to be uneconomic. But the kicker to all this is the largest beneficiaries to the Inflation Reduction Act were left-wing Democratic millionaires and billionaires who invested in companies knowing that those subsidies were going to drive up market cap for those companies. They made a fortune, and they turned around and wrote big checks to these politicians. Yeah, and they built eight electric vehicle chargers. Yes, right. It's not like you even got anything for it. 100%. So what happened is the Democratic donors got paid, the Democratic politicians got paid off, and in our view, the American workers got laid off. And that is going to be a big part of the closing argument that you're going to see in some of these races. Fascinating. Stephen, thank you. And I hope to see you soon on a personal note, right? We'll have dinner, break bread, and enjoy each other's company. Stephen Law, thank you so much. Thank you for all you do, Dana.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.